I was kneeling in the backyard, struggling with a broken fence post, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I didn't look up. The wood was old, splintered, and I had no patience for it. Then came the car door slam. A deep breath. I knew who it was. He had arrived. I wiped my hands on my jeans and finally looked up. He stood there, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, scanning the house like he wasn't sure if he belonged. He was older now, sharper. The last time I'd seen him, he was a teenager, all restless energy and ambition. Now, at 28, he looked different. He had the same eyes, though, his father's eyes. "You've got a lot of space out here," he said, setting the bag down by the porch. "Too much," I admitted. Silence stretched between us, the kind that fills the gaps between people who should know each other better but don't. He didn't need to be here. He had a life in the city. But something had pushed him back. To this house. To me. Inside, I poured us coffee, my hands steady, my thoughts not so much. "So, how long do you think you'll stay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "A while," he said, eyes flickering to the window. "Just need a break from everything." I nodded, even though I didn't quite understand. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I found him outside, leaning against the porch railing, watching the sky. "Do you ever feel like life got away from you?" he asked suddenly. I exhaled. "All the time." That was the first real moment between us. No small talk, no forced politeness, just two people admitting something they'd never said out loud. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel quite so alone. The morning air was crisp when I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand. He was already outside, stretching, his breath visible in the cold. I hadn't expected him to be an early riser. "You always up this early?" I asked. "Old habit," he said, rolling his shoulders. "City life." I sipped my coffee, watching as he jogged down the dirt path leading toward the lake. It was strange, having someone else here, disrupting the silence I'd grown so used to. But it wasn't unwelcome. Later, I found him by the fence, inspecting the section I'd struggled with. Without a word, he grabbed a hammer and started working. I hesitated before joining him. We worked side by side, the rhythm of hammering filling the space between us. "I don't think I ever saw you do this kind of work before," I said. He smirked. "There's a lot you don't know about me." There was something in the way he said it that made me pause. I didn't ask what he meant. Instead, we kept working. And when we were done, we stood back, looking at our handiwork. That night, he sat on the porch, flipping through an old photo album he'd found inside. "You look different here," he said, holding up a picture. I glanced at it. Me, much younger, smiling. "We all change," I murmured. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "Some more than others." The storm rolled in fast, heavy raindrops drumming against the windows as the sky darkened. I was in the kitchen, sorting through a drawer of old papers, when the power flickered and went out. A deep, humming silence filled the house. Then, footsteps. His. "No power?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. "Looks like it," I sighed, rubbing my temples. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the dim light. "Guess we're stuck for a while." I nodded, setting the papers aside. He sat across from me at the table, the flashlight between us, shadows playing across his face. "This house feels different in the dark," he murmured. "It's quieter," I said. "Makes you think too much." He studied me, something unreadable in his expression. "That a bad thing?" I hesitated. "Depends on the thoughts." A gust of wind rattled the windows, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he leaned back, stretching his arms. "You ever think about leaving?" I frowned. "Leaving? This place, starting over." I let out a soft laugh. "At my age?" He didn't smile. "Why not?" The question lingered between us, too heavy, too real. I had no answer. Outside, the rain poured harder, sealing us inside a house full of memories neither of us could escape. By morning, the storm had passed, but the weight of the night still hung in the air. I kept myself busy, cleaning the kitchen, folding laundry, anything to keep my mind from circling back. But avoidance never lasts long. I found him in the living room, flipping through an old book. The quiet between us was different now, charged with something unspoken. I sat across from him, my hands wrapped around a warm mug, but neither of us said a word. Then, as if drawn by something neither of us fully understood, he set the book down and moved closer. It was instinctive, inevitable. A pause, a hesitation. Then it happened. It was brief, unexpected, and irreversible. The second it was over, reality crashed in. I pulled back, my heart hammering. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "That probably shouldn't have happened," I murmured, voice unsteady. He didn't argue. Instead, he stood, pacing, jaw clenched. "I should go," he said finally, voice tight. I nodded, but I didn't move. He grabbed his jacket, pausing at the door like he wanted to say something. But whatever it was, he swallowed it down and walked out. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, staring at the empty space he'd left behind, knowing things could never go back to the way they were. The house felt different after he left, quieter, heavier. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, avoiding the space where it happened, as if physical distance could undo the past. But memories don't work like that. Days passed without a word from him. I told myself it was for the best, that whatever had happened was a mistake, a moment of weakness. I threw myself into routines, but nothing felt the same. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. Then, one evening, just as the sky turned that deep, bruised purple of early twilight, his car pulled into the driveway. My breath caught, but I didn't move. Not when he stepped out, not when he hesitated on the porch. The knock came, soft but certain. I opened the door. He stood there, eyes searching mine. He looked different, like someone who had spent too much time in his own head. I knew the feeling well. "I wasn't sure if I should come back," he admitted. I folded my arms, unsure if I was ready for this conversation. "And yet, here you are." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I didn't want to leave things like that." A pause. The air between us felt fragile, like one wrong word could shatter it completely. "It's not that simple," I finally said. "I know," he murmured. Silence stretched between us, thick with everything we weren't saying. Then, as if realizing there were no right words, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, setting it gently on the porch railing before stepping back. I looked down. A set of old keys. My breath caught. These weren't his, they were mine. The spare set I'd given him when he first arrived, in case he ever needed them. He met my gaze. "I figured you might want these back." I stared at them, at the worn metal glinting under the porch light. Then, without thinking, I curled my fingers around them. They were still warm from his hand. For a moment, I thought he might say something else, that he might reach for me, that I might let him. But instead, he just nodded. Then he turned, walked down the steps, and got into his car. The engine rumbled to life. He pulled out of the driveway, tail lights disappearing into the night. I stood there long after he was gone, keys clutched tight in my palm. I should have felt relief. I should have been grateful for the clean break. But all I could think about was how, for the first time in a long time, someone had left and made sure I could still let them back in.